He tried to humiliate his black wife at the gala. She turned the tables with a public revelation. The champagne flute trembled in Hope's manicured fingers as she watched her husband of 3 years lean into the microphone at the front of the opulent ballroom. The crystal chandelier above cast fractured light across her dark skin, but nothing could illuminate the cold dread settling in her chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice boomed across the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, his practiced smile gleaming white against his tanned face. "Before we begin tonight's auction, I have a rather personal announcement to make." Hope's breath caught. They hadn't discussed any announcement. Her emerald silk gown suddenly felt too tight, the hundreds of eyes in the room pressing against her like physical weight. She stood frozen near the back wall, invisible among Seattle's elite, doctors, lawyers, tech moguls, all of whom had whispered behind gloved hands when Richard first brought his exotic wife to these events. "You see, marriage teaches you things about a person," Richard continued, his tone shifting to something she'd never heard before, cruel, calculated. "Things you never knew when you were blinded by, let's call it infatuation." The room fell silent except for the soft clink of jewelry and nervous shifting in seats. Hope's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just any announcement. This was her execution. Richard's eyes found hers across the crowded room, and for a split second, she saw something that made her stomach lurch. Not love, not even indifference, but satisfaction. Pure, vindictive satisfaction. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying easily over the hushed crowd, "you discover that the person you married isn't quite who you thought they were." But as Hope watched her husband prepare to destroy her in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle, something unexpected flickered in her chest. Not the shame he expected. Not the devastation he'd planned for. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile curved her lips. Because Richard had no idea what she'd discovered about him just 3 days ago, or what she was prepared to do about it. 3 years earlier, Hope Williams had been Seattle's most promising young architect, her designs gracing the covers of Architectural Digest and her firm winning awards that established professionals twice her age envied. She was brilliant, driven, and fiercely independent, qualities that both attracted and threatened the men in her circle. Richard Whitmore III came from old money, the kind that built cities and named hospitals. His family's foundation hosted the gala where powerful people wrote checks to feel better about their privilege. When he'd pursued Hope with the intensity of a man unused to hearing no, she'd mistaken his persistence for genuine love. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of private jets, weekend getaways to his family's vineyard in Napa, and intimate dinners where he'd listened, or seemed to listen, to her dreams of designing sustainable housing for underserved communities. He'd called her brilliant, extraordinary, his beautiful exception. Hope's best friend Zara had warned her. "He collects things, Hope. Rare art, vintage cars, exotic women. What happens when the novelty wears off?" But Hope had been intoxicated by Richard's world, by the way doors opened when his name was mentioned, by the security his wealth promised. She'd convinced herself that love could bridge any gap, racial, cultural, economic. The cracks had appeared slowly. Richard's suggestions about her appearance at social events. His subtle discouragement when she talked about pro bono projects. The way he'd introduce her as my wife rather than by name, as if her identity existed only in relation to him. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Hope's therapist and the only person who truly understood the complexity of her situation, had helped her see what she'd been unwilling to acknowledge. When someone shows you who they are, Hope, believe them the first time. But it wasn't until 3 days ago that Hope discovered just how calculated Richard's affection had been, and how expendable he considered her now that the shine had worn off. 3 days before the gala, Hope had returned home early from a client meeting, her heels clicking against the marble floor of their Bellevue mansion. She'd planned to surprise Richard with dinner reservations at their old favorite restaurant, a desperate attempt to recapture something that felt increasingly lost between them. The sound of Richard's laughter drifted from his study, followed by a woman's voice she didn't recognize. Hope paused at the partially open door, her hand frozen on the handle. "The timing couldn't be more perfect," Richard was saying. "The prenup ensures she gets practically nothing, and after tonight's little revelation, she'll be so humiliated she'll probably disappear on her own." "You're terrible," the woman giggled, a sound that made Hope's stomach clench. "What exactly are you planning to tell them?" "Oh, something deliciously scandalous about her past. Maybe that scholarship she got to MIT. I've done some digging, and there are questions about whether she really deserved it, or if it was just another diversity handout. The trust fund babies at the gala will eat it up." Hope's vision blurred. The scholarship he was referring to had been merit-based, earned through countless sleepless nights and a 4.0 GPA. She'd worked 2 jobs to supplement it, living on ramen and determination while her classmates enjoyed spring breaks in Cabo. "And then what?" the woman pressed. "You'll be free to marry me. Eventually. After the dust settles. We'll need to be careful about appearances. Can't have people thinking I traded one diversity hire for another." The casual cruelty of his words hit Hope like a physical blow. She gripped the door frame, her engagement ring, a symbol she'd once treasured, now feeling like a shackle around her finger. But as the initial shock wore off, something harder crystallized in her chest. Richard thought he knew her, thought he could predict her response, thought she would crumble under his public humiliation. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The next 48 hours had been a masterclass in deception. Hope smiled through their morning coffee routine, kissed his cheek goodbye as he left for work, and even helped him choose his tuxedo for the gala, all while methodically gathering evidence of his betrayal. She'd always been thorough, a trait that made her an exceptional architect. That same precision now served her in ways Richard could never have anticipated. Hope accessed his home office computer while he showered, photographing documents and email exchanges that painted a picture of a man whose public philanthropy masked private cruelty. The Whitmore Foundation, she discovered, was little more than a tax shelter. Donations meant for homeless shelters were redirected to private investments. Scholarship funds vanished into administrative costs that suspiciously matched Richard's personal expenses. But the most damning discovery came when she found correspondence with his father about the Hope situation. Their marriage had been strategic from the beginning, a way for Richard to appear progressive and socially conscious while running for city council. Her race, her background, her success, it had all been part of his calculated image makeover. The diversity angle served its purpose, Richard had written to his father 6 months ago, but it's becoming a liability now. The voters I need don't relate to her, and she's getting too comfortable questioning my decisions. Time to cut losses. Hope photographed everything, her hands steady despite the rage building in her chest. She thought of every time she'd adjusted her personality to fit his world, every cultural tradition she'd downplayed, every time she'd bitten her tongue when his friends made casual racist comments disguised as jokes. On the morning of the gala, as Richard hummed happily in the shower, preparing for what he thought would be her social execution, Hope made the final preparations for his. She called Zara first. "I need you to trust me tonight. And I need you to bring your camera." Then she called Dr. Vasquez. "I think I'm finally ready to stop trying to fix something that was broken from the start." Now, standing in the ballroom as Richard continued his calculated assassination of her character, Hope felt a strange calm settle over her. She watched him gesture grandly, his voice carrying across the room as he spun his lies. "My wife, you see, has been, shall we say, creative with the truth about her background. That prestigious scholarship to MIT? Let's just say there are questions about whether merit was the primary factor in that decision." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Hope saw Mrs. Aldridge, the governor's wife, shake her head in apparent disappointment. Judge Harrison frowned, his opinion clearly shifting. These people, who had barely tolerated her presence, now felt vindicated in their initial prejudices. But Hope had learned something about power in the 3 years she'd spent in Richard's world. It wasn't just about money or connections, it was about narrative. Control the story, and you control everything. Furthermore, Richard continued, his confidence growing with each nod from the audience, "I've discovered that she's been using our marriage to advance her career inappropriately, leveraging our family name for contracts That's fascinating, darling." Hope's voice cut through his speech like a blade through silk. Every head in the room turned as she began walking toward the front, her emerald gown flowing behind her like water. Her steps were measured, confident, each click of her heels against the marble floor echoing in the suddenly silent ballroom. Richard's face went pale. This wasn't part of his script. "Really, truly fascinating," Hope continued, her voice carrying easily without the microphone. "Years of presenting to boardrooms had taught her how to project authority. I had no idea you'd become such a gifted storyteller." She reached the front of the room and gently took the microphone from Richard's slack grip. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost, which, in a way, he was. The Hope he thought he'd married, the one who would crumble under public humiliation, had died the moment she'd overheard his conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hope said, her smile radiant and deadly, "my husband is absolutely right. Marriage does teach you things about a person. Things you never could have imagined." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Hope stood at the podium facing the sea of Seattle's most influential citizens. These people had never truly accepted her, had always seen her as Richard's exotic accessory, proof of his progressive values. Now they stared at her with barely concealed anticipation, waiting to watch her public destruction. Richard reached for the microphone, his composure cracking. "Hope, darling, perhaps we should." "Should what?" she asked, tilting her head with genuine curiosity. "Continue your fascinating story about my fraudulent scholarship? Or perhaps move on to these career-advancing contracts you mentioned?" The room held its collective breath. Hope could see Zara near the back, her camera subtly positioned, and Dr. Vasquez in the corner, her therapist's professional mask not quite hiding her concern. This was the moment Richard had orchestrated so carefully. Her humiliation, her exile from his world, her reduction to nothing more than a cautionary tale about ambitious women who reached too high. Standing there, surrounded by hostile faces and whispered judgments, Hope felt the full weight of her isolation. Richard's version of events would be believed because these people wanted to believe it. It confirmed their biases, justified their subtle exclusions, validated their initial discomfort with her presence in their rarefied circles. For just a moment, the old Hope, the one who had learned to make herself smaller, quieter, more palatable, whispered that she should retreat. Accept defeat. Disappear gracefully and rebuild her life away from their judgment. "You know what the most heartbreaking thing is?" Hope said softly, the microphone amplifying her words across the silent ballroom. "I actually believed he loved me." Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Several women nodded, recognizing the universal pain of betrayal. "I believed it when he said I was brilliant. When he said our differences made us stronger. When he promised to stand beside me against a world that would question our marriage." Richard's jaw tightened. This wasn't going according to his plan. "And the truly tragic thing," Hope continued, her voice breaking just slightly, "is that I was willing to change everything about myself to keep that love. To become smaller, quieter, less inconvenient." But then Hope's voice strengthened, her spine straightening as she looked directly at Richard. "Until I realized that what I thought was love was actually something much more calculating." She reached into her small evening bag and withdrew her phone, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "You see, Richard is absolutely right about one thing. Marriage does reveal who people really are." "Hope, don't," Richard started forward, but she stepped smoothly away from him. "For instance, it reveals whether someone married you for love, or because their political consultant suggested that a successful black wife would help with voter demographics for their city council run." The murmur that went through the crowd was different now, sharper, more interested. Hope had their attention. It reveals whether someone genuinely supports your career, or whether they are concerned that your pro bono work with affordable housing might alienate their real estate developer friends. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Aldridge's expression had shifted from disapproving to curious. "And sometimes," Hope continued, her voice growing stronger, "marriage reveals that someone has been systematically embezzling from their family's charitable foundation for 3 years." The ballroom erupted. Richard lunged for the microphone, but Hope stepped aside with the grace of a dancer, her architect's spatial awareness serving her well. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his polished facade cracking completely. "I'm telling our story, darling," Hope replied sweetly. "Our real story." She turned back to the crowd, many of whom were now standing, their earlier hostility replaced by rapt attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present the real Richard Whitmore III. The man who diverted $2.3 million meant for homeless shelters into private cryptocurrency investments. The man who used scholarship funds to pay for weekend trips with his mistress. The man who planned this entire evening as a way to publicly dispose of his inconvenient wife before announcing his candidacy for city council." The ballroom exploded into chaos. Voices rose in outrage, disbelief, and demand for answers. Camera phones appeared despite the event's no recording policy. Judge Harrison was already reaching for his own phone, likely calling the district attorney's office. Richard grabbed Hope's arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "You stupid bitch, you have no idea what you've just done." The mask was finally off completely. This was the man she'd glimpsed in overheard conversations, the one who saw her as nothing more than a diversity prop to be used and discarded. "Actually, I know exactly what I've done," Hope replied calmly, not flinching from his grip. "I've told the truth. Something you might want to try sometime." "You'll get nothing in the divorce," he snarled. "The prenup. The prenup that you had your lawyer draft while already planning to commit fraud." Hope's smile was serene. The one that becomes void when one party enters the marriage under false pretenses? That prenup. Richard's face went ashen as the implications hit him. Hope had done her homework thoroughly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hope announced, her voice carrying over the chaos, "I have extensive documentation of everything I've shared with you tonight. Financial records, email correspondences, recorded conversations, all obtained legally from our shared home computer and phone systems." She looked directly at the crowd, many of whom were now staring at Richard with undisguised disgust. "The FBI Financial Crimes Unit will receive copies tomorrow morning. The State Attorney General's office will have them by Monday. And the Seattle Times will have the full story for Wednesday's edition." "You vindictive," Richard started. "No," Hope interrupted, her voice cutting through his rage like steel. "I'm not vindictive. I'm simply done being silent while you try to destroy me to cover your own crimes." She turned to address the crowd one final time. "My scholarship to MIT was merit-based, earned through a 4.0 GPA and scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests. I worked 2 jobs to supplement it because my family couldn't afford the full cost. I've never used my marriage for professional advantage. In fact, I've turned down several lucrative contracts specifically to avoid any appearance of impropriety." Her voice softened, becoming almost conversational. "But I did make one crucial mistake. I believed that love could overcome prejudice. I thought that if I just tried hard enough, proved myself worthy enough, became small enough, I could earn acceptance in a world determined to see me as an outsider." The ballroom had fallen completely silent now. "Tonight, I realized something important. I don't need your acceptance. I never did." 6 months later, Hope stood in her new office overlooking Elliott Bay, the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows she'd designed herself. The view was spectacular, but what filled her with satisfaction was the plaque on her door. "Williams Sustainable Design, Architecture for Social Impact." The divorce had been swift once Richard's financial crimes came to light. The prenup, as she'd predicted, was voided, and his conviction for embezzlement and fraud meant he'd be spending the next several years in federal prison. The Whitmore Foundation was under federal oversight, its remaining assets redirected to legitimate charitable causes. More importantly, Hope had reclaimed herself. Her new firm focused exclusively on affordable housing and community development projects. She'd turned down 3 offers to design homes for former members of Richard's social circle, people who now wanted to associate with the woman who'd exposed corruption in their midst. Dr. Vasquez visited her new office for their monthly session, a practice Hope had maintained even after her personal crisis passed. "How do you feel about the gala now?" Dr. Vasquez asked, settling into the comfortable chair Hope had placed by the window. Hope considered the question carefully. "Grateful," she said finally. "Richard thought he was humiliating me, but he actually freed me. He forced me to find my voice again." "And the loneliness? The social exile you were so afraid of?" Hope smiled, gesturing to the bustling office around them. "I have Zara. I have you. I have colleagues who respect my work. I have clients whose lives are genuinely improved by what I create. I realized I was never actually part of Richard's world. I was just visiting it." Through her window, she could see the construction site where her latest project was taking shape. A mixed-income housing development that would provide homes for families who'd been priced out of the city. It was work that mattered, work that aligned with her values rather than forcing her to compromise them. Her phone buzzed with a text from Zara. "Coffee later? I have news about the documentary deal." The story of that night at the gala had indeed become a story worth telling, a cautionary tale about power, privilege, and the courage it takes to speak truth in the face of destruction. Hope typed back, "Absolutely. And Zara, thank you for believing in me when I'd forgotten how to believe in myself." As she returned to reviewing blueprints for her next project, a women's shelter downtown, Hope reflected on the strange mathematics of betrayal and recovery. Richard had calculated that destroying her publicly would be his path to greater power. Instead, his cruelty had revealed her own strength. Sometimes the person who tries to break you ends up freeing you instead. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you never knew you needed. Hope Williams had learned to love herself enough to demand better, and that, more than any romantic fairy tale, was a love story worth celebrating. Tell us, have you ever found strength in your darkest moment? Hit the like button if you believe that sometimes the person who breaks your heart also breaks you free.